Let's talk about some audit documentation for a second. I always find this part of the section very helpful because before I interned, I wish I would have known some of these terms. I did not. It took me about 3 weeks to figure out what a tick mark was. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about audit documentation. So PCAOB AS 12 defines audit documentation as what? What's their kind of overall definition for what's considered audit documentation? So it's the written documentation or written proof, or what does it say? Written record for the basis of the auditor's conclusions. Remember what I said when we talked about PCAOB inspections, that basically if the auditor didn't document, it didn't happen. The auditor has to have documentation to support their audit opinion because they needed to have, according to GAS, they needed sufficient appropriate audit evidence. Well, if you did all that testing but didn't document it, according to the PCAOB, it didn't happen. So that's why documentation is so important, because you have to have that written record, that basis for supporting your audit conclusion, supporting your audit opinion, right? That's why audit documentation is so important. So when we talk about audit documentation, there's something called a permanent file and a current file. You guys aren't old enough, but I was before we were paperless. I remember one of my first jobs as an intern was copying bundles, like, because you had to have that audit documentation. We didn't have electronic records that were able to sustain all of the audit. Now we're paperless, but back in the day, not so much. So what is a permanent file? And how is that different from a current file? So the permanent file is also called the continuing audit file. That's going to include any of the information from previous audit years, right? The audit team is still going to use the permanent file year after year because all that due diligence that they did about understanding the company, the company's charter, bylaws, maybe their organization chart, things that don't change about the company is still going to be in there. So the audit team uses the permanent file. It's going to have things like I just listed: charters, bylaws, partnership agreements, important contracts or leases, company history, background, minutes from old stockholders meetings, the prior year's financial statements, anything that is older than 1 year, right? So from previous audits versus, as Michael mentioned, the current file, it's going to have things that are less than 1 year in it, right? Where would this year's engagement letter go? It'd be in the current file for this year, this audit year. Where would the previous audit year's engagement letter be? It'd be in the permanent file. Where would this year's continuance letter or acceptance letter? Current file, right? So you kind of get it. The current file is going to include this audit year's engagement letter, their client acceptance or continuance documentation, any staff notes. This is where this year's audit plan is, any conclusions, preliminary analytical procedures, all that stuff would be in the current file. But things like bylaws, org charts, contracts, things that don't change from year to year, it's going to be in the permanent file. Last but not least, what's a lead schedule? You guys ever heard of a lead schedule before? See if I have one in here. This is a lead schedule. Again, terms I didn't necessarily know when I first interned. It's going to be a summary of accounts for a component or group. For example, this is a cash lead schedule. What's on that cash lead schedule? Well, it's going to have all the different cash accounts on it. So if they have a bank account with First National, there it is. They have a bank account with Second National, that's going to go on the lead schedule. So it's going to be a summary of accounts for an account group. So accounts payable would have a lead schedule, right? That's going to list all the different accounts payables on it. Accounts receivable would have a lead schedule, also an aging. It's going to have all the accounts receivables on it. So you see for the cash lead schedule, it has a summary of all their cash accounts. They have two. The auditor is going to use this particular lead schedule to test, because this amount right here should agree to the amount for cash on the trial balance. It should agree to prior year's number beginning, the current ledger amounts, and the adjustments, auditing statements, things like that. So let's go back, because as we talk about the lead schedule, we're also going to be talking about indexing, cross-referencing, heading, signatures, dates, tick marks, all that good stuff. This is one of the reasons why you have to label your quizzes the way that you do. Practice for auditing. So let's take this for example, indexing. Indexing is a way to help the auditor reference and cross-reference, right? So you notice in the upper right-hand corner for this example, there are certain references or labels. This is how the auditor has indexed these particular worksheets. So the trial balance here is trial balance TB-1. Notice that on the trial balance, there's references to different lead schedules. A1 for cash, B1 for accounts receivable, C1 for inventory. So for cash, it says A1. I would expect then to go to the upper right-hand corner and see A1, right? That's how these work papers are indexed. Notice that even on the lead schedule, there are even more references. Well, you see A2. A2 is the bank reconciliation for First National. A3, I would expect to see the bank reconciliation for Second National. When I get to the bank reconciliation, guess what? On it, I should expect to see a reference for A2-1, letting me know that the auditors actually confirmed that bank balance from the bank reconciliation. And again, we'll get into more detail on this when we get in the cash chapter, but this is just trying to help you understand how some of the work papers might be organized. Let's go here. Notice that on top of the auditing work paper, you'll see a label telling you what the company is, what this document is, you know, the date involved, and whether or not it is a third-party document or something you got internal. So for the bank reconciliation, is it something that the auditor got from a third party, or is it something that they got from the client? And how would you know? Just by looking at it. Very tiny, but it's up there. It literally says prepared by client. So sometimes it might say PBC up here, but it's going to tell you if it came from the client. You notice also up here that you get the initials and the date that the person who performed this audit procedure or step or tested this work paper and who reviewed it and when they reviewed it. Then you've got these things called tick marks, right? Tick marks are just shorthand for how auditors reference the work paper they're testing. Every firm, every auditor pretty much can have different tick marks, but some of them are standard. I know I worked for a senior who used smiley faces, which was kind of weird, but as long as there was a legend down here explaining what it was, you can use whatever you want. But for the most part, standard tick marks kind of look like this. It tells me that, you know, shorthand for what the test was that they performed. So an F stands for footed, meaning that they added these numbers and they add up correctly, because you have to check to make sure there are no errors, right, in adding. The C next to the bank balance, the C says that it was confirmed. And remember I said that, well, on the bank confirmation, I would expect to see A-2-1. Well, that's where that reference came from. Other things like vouch, compared. If there was any issues, I would list it there. That is it. All right.